There is a story about Nancy Reagan that people who worked in the White House used to tell quietly, almost with a kind of awe. On the nights Ronald Reagan came home late from a long day of meetings, she would wait up, not because protocol required it, not because anyone expected her to. She just waited. And when he walked through the door, something in the room visibly changed for both of them. For nearly 50 years, theirs was one of the most talked about marriages in American public life. And yet the full picture, where it started, what it cost, and what it was actually built on, is a great deal more complicated than the love story the public was given. Before the White House, before Sacramento, before any of it, there was a woman trying to hold her life together in Hollywood, and the man she found there would change everything. The woman before the First Lady. To understand Nancy Reagan, you have to start before Ronald Reagan. She was born Anne Frances Robbins on July 6, 1921, in New York City. Her father, Kenneth Robbins, was a used car salesman from New Jersey, and her mother, Edith Luckett, was a stage actress with genuine talent and a wide circle of theatrical friends. The marriage did not survive long after Nancy's birth. By the time Nancy was 2, Edith had left to pursue her acting career on the road, and Nancy was sent to live with her aunt and uncle in Bethesda, Maryland. That arrangement lasted for years. Nancy lived with her mother's sister Virginia and her husband, Audley Galbraith. Affectionate, but stern, by the accounts of people who knew the household. She was not mistreated, but she was profoundly aware of being apart from her mother, and those who later became close to her described a quality she carried, an almost physical need for closeness, for the reassurance of presence that seemed to trace back to those years of waiting for Edith to return. The situation changed in 1929 when Edith married a prominent Chicago neurosurgeon named Loyal Davis. He was everything Kenneth Robbins had not been: successful, serious, deeply conservative in his politics and his temperament, and entirely devoted to Edith. He was also, from the moment Edith brought Nancy into their household, willing to take on the role of father. Nancy adored him. The feeling was mutual. When Loyal Davis formally adopted Nancy in 1935, she was 14 years old and had been living with him and Edith for 6 years. She took his last name without hesitation. From that point forward, she was Nancy Davis, and the values Loyal Davis held, his conservatism, his sense of propriety, his belief in hard work and personal responsibility, became the architecture of how she saw the world. She was educated at Girls' Latin School in Chicago, and then at Smith College in Massachusetts, where she majored in theater. She graduated in 1943 and did what Edith's daughter was almost destined to do. She went to New York and tried to become an actress. Through her mother's connections, doors opened. Nancy worked in summer stock, appeared in a Broadway production, and eventually caught the attention of a talent scout for MGM. In 1949, she was signed to a contract with the studio and moved to Los Angeles. She made movies, none of them landmarks, and was professional and entirely aware that she was operating at the edges of stardom rather than its center. And then her name appeared on a list, and that is where everything that followed actually begins. A name on a list. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Hollywood was under the shadow of the House Un-American Activities Committee, the congressional investigation into alleged communist influence in the film industry. The investigations were aggressive, careers were destroyed by association, and the industry was tense in ways that are difficult to fully convey to anyone who did not live through it. In 1949 or early 1950, the exact timing is slightly uncertain, Nancy Davis discovered that her name had appeared on a list of suspected communist sympathizers circulating in Hollywood. It was a case of mistaken identity. There was another actress named Nancy Davis, and it was almost certainly that woman whose name belonged on the list. But in that climate, the distinction barely mattered. The name was out there. Nancy went to her director at MGM, Mervyn Leroy, who told her the best way to clear her name was to be seen publicly with someone of unimpeachable anti-communist credentials. Someone whose politics were so clearly on the right side of the debate that mere association would dissolve the problem. He suggested Ronald Reagan. Reagan was at that time the president of the Screen Actors Guild, one of the most politically engaged figures in Hollywood, someone who had worked closely with investigators looking into communist infiltration of the unions. His credibility on the issue was solid. Leroy called Reagan, explained the situation, and arranged a dinner. Whether this was a genuine strategy or a convenient excuse engineered by Nancy, who had already noticed Ronald Reagan and was quite deliberately interested in meeting him, is something people close to her have debated for decades. What is known is that Nancy had seen Reagan on screen and expressed admiration before any of this list business arose. The dinner was real. The pretext may have been at least partially manufactured. They met in November of 1949. Reagan was 38. Nancy was 28. He was also in a significant amount of personal turmoil. His first marriage to the actress Jane Wyman had ended in divorce that same year, and he showed up to dinner, prepared to be pleasant and helpful, and go home. Something shifted. They talked for hours. He called her again. Within a few months, it was clear to everyone around them that whatever had started as a dinner to solve a professional problem had become something else entirely. The shadow of Jane Wyman. To understand what Ronald Reagan brought to his relationship with Nancy Davis, you have to understand what he was coming out of. His first marriage to Jane Wyman had been one of the more discussed Hollywood unions of the 1940s. Wyman was, by the time the marriage ended, the more successful of the two. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1948 for Johnny Belinda, while Reagan's film career had plateaued. The dynamic had shifted, uncomfortably. Wyman later said that Reagan talked about politics constantly and that she had grown tired of it. She filed for divorce in 1948, and it was finalized in 1949. They had 2 children, Maureen, born in 1941, and Michael, whom they adopted in 1945. A third pregnancy had ended in a premature birth, a daughter who lived only briefly, and by several accounts, that grief had deepened the distance between them rather than closing it. Reagan was genuinely shaken by the divorce. Friends described a man who had believed in the institution of marriage and found himself, without a clear single cause, outside of one. He threw himself into his Screen Actors Guild work and into staying busy. Nancy stepped into that particular landscape. A man who had been hurt, who was guarded in ways he did not fully show, and who was, beneath the natural ease and the famous charm, someone who needed steadiness. She provided it. That quality she had developed over those years of waiting for Edith, that deep capacity for focused, undivided attention, turned out to be exactly what Reagan responded to. She also, quite deliberately, made herself available. She did not play games. She was clear, from early in the relationship, that she was serious. People who knew her then and later recalled that Nancy Davis decided fairly quickly that Ronald Reagan was the person she wanted to build her life around, and she went about that with a directness that surprised people who expected Hollywood courtship to be more complicated. Reagan, for his part, moved slowly. He was not in a rush to remarry. He cared about Nancy, that was evident. But he was also wary, still working through what the end of his first marriage had meant. The engagement, when it finally came in late 1951, was not the result of a dramatic proposal, but of a quiet conversation in which both of them agreed that getting married was what they were going to do. They married on March 4th, 1952, in a small ceremony at the Little Brown Church in the San Fernando Valley. The ceremony was modest, deliberately private, attended by a handful of friends, including the actor William Holden, who served as best man. Nancy wore a grey wool suit. There was no elaborate reception. They went directly from the ceremony to a brief honeymoon at the Mission Inn in Riverside. By any external measure, it was a quiet beginning for what would become one of the most publicly scrutinized marriages in American history. But those who were there that day described something between them that did not require elaboration. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they had been looking for. What they did not advertise in those early days was that Nancy was already pregnant. Their daughter Patty was born on October 22nd, 1952, 7.5 months after the wedding. It was the kind of detail that, in 1952 in Hollywood, required careful management. The timing was noted by some and ignored by others. Nancy and Ronald simply moved forward. The years nobody talks about. The 1950s were not easy for the Reagans. Ronald Reagan's film career had stalled significantly. He was not getting the roles he wanted, and the ones he was offered were not the kind that built or sustained a major career. He made westerns, he made television appearances, and in 1954 he took a job as the host and occasional performer on a weekly television program for General Electric called General Electric Theatre. A decision that the Hollywood of the time tended to view as a step backward, but that would turn out to be something else entirely. The General Electric job required Reagan to travel extensively, visiting GE plants and speaking to workers and community groups. He did this for 8 years, giving essentially the same speech about free enterprise and the dangers of government overreach, refining it each time, learning what landed and what did not, developing the skills of a public speaker at a level that no acting class could have provided. By the time he was done, he was one of the most polished political communicators in the country. He just did not know yet that that was what he was. Nancy was home with the children. Patty had been born in 1952, and their son, Ronald Prescott Reagan, Ron, arrived in 1958. Nancy also had a relationship to manage with Reagan's children from his first marriage, Maureen and Michael, and that relationship was complicated from the beginning. Maureen Reagan, who was 11 when her father married Nancy, later wrote about the early years with a candor that is sometimes uncomfortable to read. Feeling shut out, not warmly received, not made to feel the new household, was one in which she genuinely belonged. Michael Reagan similarly described a distant relationship with Nancy during those years. He has also written about being subjected to harmful behavior by a camp counselor as a child, an experience that marked his childhood significantly. Nancy's defenders have argued the situation was complicated by Reagan's own reluctance to engage with the tensions between his two families. But the accounts from Maureen and Michael are consistent enough that they are difficult to dismiss. What is clearer is that Nancy's primary focus, from the beginning, was Ronald. Not in a passive or subordinate way, more in the way of someone who had identified her central purpose and organized everything else around it. She was interested in the children, she was interested in the household, she was interested in the various social obligations of a Hollywood wife. But Reagan was the fixed point. Everything revolved around him. He felt the same way about her. Those who observed them in domestic settings during the 1950s consistently noted the quality of attention they paid each other. The way Reagan would reach for her hand without thinking about it. The way Nancy's eyes tracked him in a room. It was not performance. It was just how they were together. What was building beneath the surface of those quiet domestic years, though? The speeches, the political evolution, the gradual transformation of a Hollywood actor into something else, was about to break into the open in a way nobody had fully anticipated. The speech that changed everything. On October 27, 1964, Ronald Reagan gave a televised speech on behalf of Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. It was called A Time for Choosing, and it ran on national television and laid out Reagan's political philosophy: smaller government, individual freedom, strong national defense, in language so clear and so emotionally effective that it became, almost overnight, the most talked about political speech in the country. Goldwater lost the election badly. Reagan's speech was the one thing from that campaign that survived it. Republican donors and party figures who had been watching the California political landscape suddenly had a new question: could Reagan himself run for office? Nancy knew the answer before anyone asked the question officially. She had watched her husband refine those arguments for a decade on the GE circuit. She had heard that speech in its various forms more times than she could count. She understood, perhaps more clearly than he did in those early days, that the skills he had spent years developing were not really acting skills anymore. They were political skills. When California Republican figures approached Reagan about running for governor in 1966, Nancy was supportive. She was also, from the very beginning of his political career, a presence in it that went considerably beyond the conventional role of political wife. She attended strategy meetings. She paid close attention to polling and public perception. She had opinions about staff, about messaging, about who should and should not be in her husband's orbit, and she expressed them. This is where the story of the Reagan marriage starts to become genuinely complicated, because the public version and the private version diverge significantly. The public version, carefully maintained by the Reagan operation from the beginning, was of a devoted, supportive wife who stood by her husband, believed in him absolutely, and otherwise stayed in the background. The private version, as documented by Reagan staffers, political aides, journalists, and eventually biographers, was of a woman who was deeply involved in personnel decisions, who was not shy about making her views known, and who had real power within the operation, power that was exercised quietly but consistently. Reagan won the California governorship in 1966, defeating the incumbent Pat Brown by nearly 1 million votes. He was inaugurated on January 2nd, 1967. Nancy became First Lady of California, and the machinery of what would eventually become the Reagan political enterprise, the image, the scheduling, the careful management of access, began to take shape around her. Sacramento and the astrologer. The years in Sacramento, from 1967 to 1975, are the period where you start to see most clearly how the Reagan marriage actually functioned as a political partnership, and where some of the aspects of Nancy's role that would later attract significant attention first became visible. She redecorated the governor's mansion, which she found insufficiently comfortable, and the family eventually moved to a private home in a better part of Sacramento. A decision that drew some criticism at the time, but that Nancy pushed through regardless. She was not a woman who accepted arrangements she considered inadequate simply because changing them would attract attention. She cultivated relationships with wealthy California Republicans who became essential to the Reagan political network. She attended events. She charmed donors. She paid attention to who was useful and who was not. Those who worked in the governor's office during those years described Nancy as someone who had a long memory for both loyalty and disloyalty. People who served the governor well were remembered warmly. People who, in Nancy's view, had worked against her husband's interests were remembered differently. During this period, Nancy also began a relationship with an astrologer named Joan Quigley. It was not, in the Sacramento years, a particularly unusual thing. Astrology was not uncommon among Nancy's social circle in California. But the relationship with Quigley would become something considerably more significant later on, in ways that nobody outside a very tight circle knew about at the time. Reagan ran for president in 1976, challenging the incumbent Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination. He came very close. Ford won the nomination by a narrow margin and then lost the general election to Jimmy Carter. Reagan stepped back, gave a remarkable farewell speech at the Republican convention in Kansas City that left many people in the hall in tears, and went home to California. He was 65 years old. A lot of people assumed that was it, that the 1976 campaign had been the final attempt, that the moment had passed. Nancy did not assume that. She spent the next 4 years, quietly and methodically, helping to build the infrastructure for another run. She kept relationships with donors alive. She monitored the political landscape. She talked to people. And on November 4th, 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected the 40th President of the United States, defeating Jimmy Carter in one of the most decisive electoral victories in modern American history. He won 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. Nancy Reagan was 60 years old. She was about to become the most watched woman in the country. And she was not remotely prepared for what that was going to mean. The White House and the glare. The early months of the Reagan White House were difficult for Nancy in ways that surprised her, even though they probably should not have. She arrived with plans. The White House, in her view, needed to be brought up to a certain standard. The staterooms required updating. The entertaining needed to reflect the dignity of the office. The domestic arrangements needed attention. These were not unreasonable observations. The White House has always been something of a work in progress, and every first family has altered it in some way. But the timing was catastrophic. The country was in a recession. Unemployment was high. And the new First Lady's decision to commission a new set of White House china, 4,732 pieces at a cost of $209,000, paid for by private donations, became the story that defined her in the public mind in those early months. The press, which had not yet warmed to her, was merciless. She was depicted as extravagant, out of touch, indifferent to the economic hardships of ordinary Americans. The coverage stung her deeply. Those close to her during that period described someone who was genuinely wounded by the caricature that was forming in the press, the image of a cold, status-obsessed woman who cared more about china patterns than people. She did not recognize herself in that image, but she also did not, in those early months, know how to counteract it. The assassination attempt on March 30th, 1981, changed everything. Reagan was shot outside the Washington Hilton Hotel by a young man named John Hinckley Jr., who had developed an obsessive fixation on the actress Jodie Foster and believed that shooting the president would impress her. The bullet entered Reagan's chest and came within an inch of his heart. He was in serious condition when he arrived at George Washington University Hospital, though he famously joked with the surgeons preparing to operate on him that he hoped they were all Republicans. Nancy was not at the hotel. She was at a luncheon when the call came. She got to the hospital and saw her husband on a gurney, pale and struggling, before he was taken into surgery. The experience of that afternoon, the waiting, the not knowing, the terror of the possibility, altered something in her that never quite altered back. After March 30th, 1981, Nancy Reagan's involvement in her husband's schedule and security arrangements went from significant to something closer to total. She had always been protective. Now she was something beyond protective. She interrogated schedules. She pushed back on public appearances she considered dangerous. She wanted to know, at all times, exactly where he was and what he was doing. The staff, who had already found her demanding, found her more so. It was also after the assassination attempt that Nancy's relationship with the astrologer Joan Quigley became something that actually influenced White House scheduling. Quigley, who had called Nancy on the day of the shooting to say she could have predicted it had she been consulted, began providing astrological guidance that Nancy used, quietly, carefully, without telling most of the staff. When thinking about the president's travel and public appearance schedule, Donald Reagan, who served as Reagan's chief of staff from 1985 to 1987, later described the arrangement in considerable detail after leaving the White House. He described receiving schedules from Nancy based on Quigley's readings: good days, bad days, days when the president should not travel, days when a particular meeting was or was not astrologically favorable. Reagan was not sympathetic in his account. He and Nancy had one of the most fraught relationships in White House history, and his memoir was partly an act of settling scores. But the core of what he described, that Quigley's input affected scheduling, has been corroborated by enough other sources that it is not seriously contested. Nancy never denied the relationship with Quigley. What she disputed was the extent of Quigley's influence. She described it as a comfort, a private coping mechanism that helped her manage the fear she lived with every day after the assassination attempt, not a governing tool. The wars inside the West Wing. Nancy Reagan's relationship with Ronald Reagan's staff was, for much of the presidency, a source of considerable tension, and the tension ran in both directions. From the staff's perspective, Nancy was an unpredictable variable. She had opinions about personnel that she was not shy about expressing. She could make or break careers through nothing more than her approval or disapproval, communicated to the president in private. Staff members who fell out of her favor found themselves, often without fully understanding why, losing access and influence. Those who maintained her trust found their positions considerably more secure. From Nancy's perspective, she was doing what any person who genuinely loved Ronald Reagan would do: protecting him from people who were using him, from advisors whose interests were not the same as his, from the inevitable accumulation of ambitious people who saw proximity to the president as an opportunity for themselves. The list of officials she worked against is long and varied. She was widely reported to have contributed to the departure of several senior figures, including Edwin Meese, William Clark, and others. She had a particularly tense relationship with Michael Deaver, one of Reagan's longest-serving aides, who eventually left the White House, though Deaver himself later said that while Nancy was demanding, the relationship between them was ultimately more complicated than pure antagonism. The most public and most damaging conflict of the Reagan White House was with Donald Reagan, who became Chief of Staff in 1985 after Jim Baker moved to the Treasury. Reagan was a former Wall Street executive. He had been the head of Merrill Lynch, and he came to the job with the confidence of a man who had run large organizations and knew how to do so. He and Nancy collided almost immediately. The conflict came to a head during the Iran-Contra affair, which erupted publicly in late 1986. The scandal involved the secret sale of weapons to Iran, a country under an arms embargo, with proceeds funneled to Contra rebels in Nicaragua. It was the most serious crisis of the Reagan presidency, and it landed at a moment when the president was already dealing with a diagnosis of prostate cancer. The combination of the political crisis and the health situation left Nancy in a state of controlled emergency. She wanted Reagan gone. She believed his management of the White House had contributed to the situation, that he was not serving her husband well, and that his manner, which was blunt to the point of rudeness in her view, was damaging the administration. The battle between them played out over months, and became so well known within Washington circles that it eventually became a press story. Reagan resigned in February of 1987 after it was reported that Nancy had been lobbying for his removal. He then wrote a memoir that described the White House from his perspective in the kind of detail that made Washington uncomfortable for months. Reagan himself stayed largely above these conflicts, or appeared to. His management style was to delegate extensively, to trust the people around him, and to avoid direct confrontations with staff. This style, which had worked reasonably well in Sacramento, created in the White House an environment where Nancy's influence over personnel was magnified, precisely because the president himself was not inclined to manage those relationships directly. What was happening in those years between Ronald and Nancy personally, the private marriage inside the very public one, is harder to see. They wrote letters to each other constantly, even when they were in the same building. Reagan's letters to Nancy, which have been published, describe a man who thought about his wife with a consistency and tenderness that does not read as performance. He called her Mommy in private. She called him Ronnie. They held hands at public events. They danced together at state dinners. People who were around them in genuinely unguarded moments, not the staged photo opportunities, but the moments between events, in the car, at the residence in the evenings, described something that resisted easy cynicism. Whatever it was between them did not appear to be constructed for an audience. Just say no, and the image problem. It would be unfair to the full picture of Nancy Reagan's White House years to discuss only the conflicts and the controversies. Her anti-drug campaign, the Just Say No initiative, which she launched in 1982 and carried throughout the presidency, was, in terms of pure public outreach, one of the most ambitious projects undertaken by a First Lady up to that point. She visited drug rehabilitation centers. She met with young people. She appeared in public service announcements. She testified before the United Nations. The campaign's message, that saying no to drugs was sufficient, that willpower was the answer, drew criticism from public health experts who felt it drastically oversimplified an enormously complex problem. But the effort itself was genuine. She was not going through the motions. She also did significant work on behalf of foster grandparents, a program that connected elderly volunteers with children who had disabilities or were in difficult circumstances. A program she had begun caring about during the Sacramento years and continued advocating for in the White House. What made Nancy Reagan's public image so difficult to manage was the gap between these genuine efforts and the persona that had calcified in the press. The Queen of the White House, the woman who cared more about her clothes than the country. The China episode had set a narrative in concrete, and every subsequent extravagance, real or perceived, confirmed it for people who had decided what she was. She tried to address it directly in 1982, at the Gridiron Dinner, the annual gathering of Washington press and political figures, by appearing in costume and performing a self-deprecating musical number that made fun of her reputation for designer clothes and expensive tastes. The moment was widely praised as charming and smart. Her approval ratings improved afterward, but the improvement never quite erased the original damage. Part of the problem was that the caricature was not entirely wrong. Nancy Reagan did care about clothes, about decoration, about the aesthetics of the White House and the public presentation of the presidency. She accepted designer gowns as loans without fully grasping, in the early years at least, how that would look. She genuinely did not understand, coming from the world of Hollywood and wealthy California Republicans, why these things were problems. Learning that they were problems, and learning it publicly, was painful. She also came from a generation and a social world in which a woman's value was understood to flow significantly from the man she was attached to. That is not a defense of the worldview, it is simply a description of it. Nancy Reagan's entire identity was organized around Ronald Reagan, and while that produced extraordinary loyalty and devotion, it also meant that her own ambitions, her own interests, her own sense of self were subordinated in ways that sometimes made her brittle when the spotlight landed on her directly rather than on him. Alzheimer's and the long goodbye. Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 1994, 5 years after he left the White House. He announced it publicly in a handwritten letter to the American people in November of that year, describing his journey into the sunset of his life with the same plain, dignified language that had characterized his public voice for decades. Nancy was 63 years old when that letter was written. She would spend the next 10 years of her life as his primary caregiver, not in a hands-on nursing sense, but as the organizing presence, the person who managed his care, fought for research funding, and sat with him through the long, gradual erasure that Alzheimer's produces. The disease took him slowly. In the early years, he still recognized her. He still reached for her hand. There were stretches of time when the old Reagan was present. The smile, the humor, the particular quality of his attention. And then those stretches got shorter. And then they stopped. Nancy threw herself into advocacy for Alzheimer's research with an intensity that surprised people who had categorized her as primarily a woman of social concerns. She appeared before Congress. She spoke publicly about the experience of watching someone you love disappear while they are still physically present in the room. She became one of the most prominent voices in the country for increased federal funding for Alzheimer's research, and she took positions, most notably her support for stem cell research, which the Bush administration opposed on religious grounds, that put her in direct conflict with the political movement her husband had helped build. She did not back down. She was willing to be at odds with the Republican Party on a scientific and political question if she believed the research could help people suffering from the disease that was taking her husband. That willingness to break with her own political tribe in the service of something she believed was more important showed a part of Nancy Reagan that the White House years had not fully revealed. Reagan died on June 5, 2004, at their home in Bel Air, California. He was 93 years old. Nancy was at his bedside. She had been at his side, in one form or another, for 52 years. The state funeral was elaborate, as befitted a former president, a journey from California to Washington, a lying in state at the Capitol, a service at the National Cathedral, a return to California for burial at the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley. Nancy stood through all of it, composed, contained, wearing black, pressing her lips to the flag-draped casket in a gesture so intimate it seemed to belong to a private moment rather than a public ceremony. Afterward, she went home. And home, for the first time in half a century, did not have Ronald Reagan in it. After Reagan. The years between Ronald Reagan's death in 2004 and Nancy Reagan's own death in 2016 are, in many respects, the part of her story that receives the least attention. They were not years of political prominence or public controversy. They were years of a woman in her 80s, living quietly, trying to figure out what life meant when the person who had defined it for 50 years was gone. She remained in the house in Bel Air. She saw friends. She continued her advocacy for Alzheimer's research. She occasionally appeared at public events when she felt they were important enough. She endorsed Mitt Romney in the 2012 Republican primary with a graciousness that reflected her belief in the institution of the party, if not always its current direction. She watched, with complicated feelings that she expressed privately to friends, as the Republican Party evolved in directions that bore less and less resemblance to the movement she and Ronald had helped build. Her relationship with her children remained unresolved in some ways to the end. Patty Davis, who had been estranged from her parents for years, had written a novel widely understood to be a thinly veiled and unflattering portrait of the Reagan family, and had done a magazine spread in the 1990s that her mother found deeply embarrassing. Eventually reconciled with Nancy, particularly during the Alzheimer's years, when the shared experience of watching Reagan decline brought the family to a different kind of understanding. The reconciliation was real but complicated. The history did not disappear. It was simply set down. Ron Reagan, the younger son, had a warmer relationship with his mother than Patty did during most of the Reagan years, though he too had his political differences with the family legacy. He became a television personality and commentator, whose liberal politics were a fairly consistent source of gentle friction. Maureen Reagan, Ronald's daughter from his first marriage, had become genuinely close to her father in the later years and died of melanoma in 2001, before Ronald Reagan's own death. Michael Reagan, the adopted son, maintained a complex relationship with the family throughout. Nancy Reagan died on March 6, 2016, at her home in Bel Air. She was 94 years old. The cause of death was congestive heart failure. She was buried at the Reagan Presidential Library beside Ronald. The grave markers at the library are simple. His name, his years, the words, "I know in my heart that man is good." Hers, placed 12 years later, beside his, as she had always been. What you are left with, looking at the full arc of this marriage, is something that does not reduce easily to a single story. There was genuine love between them, consistent, documented, evident to virtually everyone who spent real time with them. There was also extraordinary ambition, careful management of image and information, and a dynamic between them that gave Nancy Reagan a kind of influence over American political life that no official title ever described. She was not elected to anything, she held no office, and yet the decisions she influenced about personnel, about scheduling, about who had access to the President of the United States, shaped the Reagan presidency in ways that historians are still untangling. She was a complicated woman who loved one man completely and organized her entire life around that love. Whether that was remarkable or limiting probably depends on who is doing the looking. What is harder to dispute is that the marriage was real, that it lasted, and that when it ended with her pressing her lips to a flag-draped casket in front of the entire world, and then going home to wait, the way she had always waited, even when there was no longer anyone coming through the door. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.